Welcome to Bible Time. We're going through the Bible at Believers Fellowship, doing a daily Bible reading. We've been going through the book of Numbers now for some time, and we're coming near the end of it. Today we're going to talk about chapters 33 and 34. But before we get to that, let me just talk to you about something that I feel very strongly about, something that I think is very important, something that has to do with how we approach the Bible and how we understand the Bible. And it's a problem that you see particularly as people come to the Old Testament, like what we're doing, working our way through the Old Testament. You cannot use an Old Testament text to say whatever you want, or you can't use it any way you want. You can't randomly assign New Testament significance to an Old Testament text unless the New Testament does that. You got to let the Old Testament say what it says. It was given for a purpose. The author had an intent. It was written by a particular person to a particular group of people at a particular time, and it had a particular point. And what we're doing in studying the Bible is understanding the point. You got to get the interpretation right. Now, how many interpretations are there? There's only one. And it's the interpretation that God had in mind when he had this scripture written. And you can apply it in a lot of different ways, but what I see is not necessarily the application. It's just a jump of interpretation. But sometimes you can do that if the New Testament gives you a path to follow. For example, a few days ago we looked at chapters 28 and 29. It talked about the priests and all the sacrifices that were made on a daily, weekly, monthly, and annual basis. And we were able to look at that, and we were able to make a connection because the New Testament makes a connection. In 1 Peter 2, Peter says that we as Christians are a holy priesthood, and we're offering up spiritual sacrifices to God. He's obviously drawing on that picture from the Old Testament, so that gives us an understanding of it, and it gives us an application of it. We're these New Testament priests, in a sense, who are offering up sacrifices, and the New Testament even lists things and identifies them as sacrifices and uses sacrificial language. So we can make that connection, but you can't do that every time. It's not like every time a priest pops up in the Old Testament text, you can say, "Oh, well, Jesus is my priest," and just boom, you do that whether the connection's there or not. Or anytime you see talk about them going into the land, the promised land, boom, I'm going to heaven. That's my promised land. Well, unless the Bible makes those connections between those particular and specific records, you can't just hop around and do it. And what's really happening is you're really not digging into the text as it's given to us in the Old Testament to understand what it's saying and what it's all about. And we're going to be coming up to the book of Joshua here. We're about to finish Numbers. We're going to do Deuteronomy. We're going to come to Joshua. And, they're going to send two spies into the land, and they're going to meet Rahab, and Rahab's going to help them. And so they make a deal to help Rahab. And they tell her to hang a scarlet cord out of her window on the city wall. Their house is on the city wall. And so that they can identify her house, and they won't destroy her and her house along with everything else. Well, the scarlet cord, is there a significance to the scarlet cord? Well, it could have just been the color of the cord that was lying around that they had to use. Or it could just be that a scarlet cord would be easy to see hanging out the window on the wall there. It could be just as simple as that. But an awful lot of people want to connect that scarlet cord to the blood of Christ. Well, where does the Bible do that? See, we got to be careful, and boy, that might sound spiritual. Wow, what insight! No, it's not. It's making stuff up is what it is. We want to be careful not to do that, and the reason is because we're just not that familiar with the Old Testament. That's the issue that we need to correct. That's the issue we need to address. We need to get to know the Old Testament. That's why we're doing this daily Bible reading through the Old Testament. And it's hard. It is hard to understand a lot of it because it's so different from what we're used to. And we might read chapters and think, wow, I didn't really get much out of that. Well, you got to be willing to do some digging. And I say all of that. That's kind of my personal rant. We're all done with that now. But I say all that because the chapters we come to today are chapters where you could just read it and go, and check it off and move on. Because chapter 33 is basically a travel log of all the places that Israel went through the wilderness, and it gives some instruction near the end for entering into the land. And then chapter 24 gives instructions on the borders of the land, and it identifies the leaders of each of the tribes, and they're going to divide up the land. And you go, okay, that has absolutely nothing to do with me. I learned nothing from that. Well, let me help you with that, and let me help you think about that a little bit. Just remember, first of all, Numbers is a book recording God's dealings with the people of Israel in the wilderness. They've come out of Egypt, and this is the time in between before they enter into Canaan. And the people of Israel are important to us because the people of Israel is who the Messiah is going to come from. And so God has an interest in these people, and so he's dealing with them here in the wilderness. And if you look at chapters 33 and 34, you could pick up on something here. If you look at it carefully, you could say that God is jealous for his glory. God is jealous for his glory. Did you notice back at the beginning of chapter 33, at verse 4, it talks about how he's bringing the people out of Egypt, and Israel's leaving Egypt while the Egyptians were burying all of their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them. And then it makes this statement, on their gods also the Lord executed judgments. Now that's a whole nother study. That would take us back into the plagues that were brought on Egypt. But God was jealous for his glory. He doesn't put up with competitors. And so he was destroying the gods of the Egyptians in that process. And then when he gives instruction about going into the land of Canaan, did you pick this up in verse 52? He says, then you should drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you and destroy all their figured stones and destroy all their metal images and demolish all their high places. That's talking about their idols. God's saying, hey, I took care of the gods in Egypt when I brought you out. Now I'm going to send you in, and we're going to deal with the gods of the Canaanites. And so God is jealous for his glory. That could be a theme of these two chapters here. And then as you break that down, we can see things that we can take out of this as we look at what God is doing. This travel log in chapter 33, you could call that, we need to trust. It's a display, it's a testimony of God's faithfulness of sustaining the people for 40 years in the wilderness. And God instructed Moses, as we're told in verse 2 of chapter 33, to write down this record of his faithfulness. So there's one point for you. Trust in God's faithfulness. That's what it's here for. Hey, remember how he faithfully led you through the land? Hey, you can trust in God's faithfulness. That's a demonstration of his character. And then at the end of chapter 33, he gives this warning about, I want you to go in and eliminate the people in Canaan, eliminate their gods, eliminate the people. And to understand that, you really need to go all the way back to Genesis 15, where God said that to Abraham, hey, your people are going to go down in Egypt for 400 years because the sin of the Canaanites hasn't reached its limit yet. But when it does, they'll come out and bring judgment on the Canaanites. That's what's happening here. But he warns them that what's going to happen if they do not drive them out. He says in verse 55, you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain will be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell, and I will do to you as I thought to do to them. That's a big time warning there, and spoiler alert, we're going to see that they didn't do this, and God's going to wind up doing exactly what he said. So here you can put down a point number 2, heed God's warnings. Heed God's warnings. See, we're drawing principles out of here, which isn't violating the text. We're looking at what the text says, and we're drawing out a principle. We're looking at what he said then, and then we're pulling out a principle that applies always. And that's what we're doing. You need to trust in God's faithfulness and heed God's warning. And then chapter 34 is all about the boundaries of the land and the leaders that are identified who are going to divide up the land amongst the tribes. And as it says back in verse 54 of chapter 33, you shall inherit the land by lot according to your clans. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance. To a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. And so he's giving instructions. Here's the boundaries. Here's the leaders. Here's how you divide it up. How about you put it down like this? If you want to be jealous for God's glory like he is, you're going to follow God's instruction. So the theme is God's jealous for his glory. You want to be jealous for God's glory as well? Well, then trust in God's faithfulness, heed God's warnings, and follow God's instructions. That's how you could look at it, this text. And that's just by reading it, making a few observations. This is what he's saying. This is what's going on. And then you draw some principles from that. And I think if you just did that, that'd give you plenty to ponder for the rest of the day. So that's what we got for today at Bible Time. And I'm thankful for this time we have together. And I trust that you'll have a great weekend. And you'll join us for worship on Sunday. And we'll see you next week for more Bible Time.